The story of the nuclear age begins in secrecy, urgency, and fear. In the early 1940s, as the world was convulsed by the violence of the Second World War, a shadowy project unfolded across the United States, drawing in the brightest scientific minds from America, Britain, and Canada. This was the Manhattan Project, a top-secret effort with a singular and daunting goal: to develop an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could unlock the secrets of the atom. The drive for this unprecedented collaboration was rooted in the chilling prospect that Hitler's regime might wield a weapon of unimaginable power, a concern that spurred the United States government into action as early as 1939, when the Advisory Committee on Uranium first convened to assess the potential of atomic energy for warfare. By 1942, the Manhattan Project had taken shape, sprawling across sites like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. The project would ultimately involve over 130,000 workers and cost nearly $2 billion, an amount equivalent to about $28 billion today. Scientists such as J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, and Niels Bohr became legendary figures in the world of science, though their work remained cloaked in secrecy until the war's end. The scale and intensity of the Manhattan Project were extraordinary, setting a precedent for future collaborations between the military, academia, and industry, a model for what would later be called Big Science. Everything changed on July 16, 1945. In the New Mexico desert, at a place known as Trinity, the world's first atomic device was detonated. The explosion lit up the sky with a force that defied comprehension and marked the true dawn of the nuclear age. When word reached President Truman, the implications were both strategic and philosophical. Humanity now possessed the means to wipe out entire cities in an instant. The event opened a door to a world where war, politics, and ethics would be forever altered. Barely a month after Trinity, the new weapon was unleashed upon Japan. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the uranium bomb known as Little Boy over Hiroshima. In a matter of seconds, as many as 70,000 people perished. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki, killing between 35,000 and 40,000 instantly. The devastation was almost beyond imagining. In the days and weeks that followed, many more died from injuries and radiation sickness, with total death toll estimates exceeding 100,000 and some placing the figure far higher. The bombings, combined with the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria, compelled Japan to surrender, bringing World War II to a close. Yet, the world's introduction to atomic warfare was not only a military event, it was an awakening to a new and terrifying reality. In the immediate aftermath, the reactions of world powers were complex and fraught with uncertainty. For the United States, the atomic bomb was initially seen as a source of unparalleled diplomatic leverage. Some officials believed that the demonstration of such overwhelming force might shape the post-war order, especially in dealings with the Soviet Union, which was itself emerging from the war as a superpower. The bomb was both a weapon and a signal. The United States possessed a monopoly on a technology that could end wars or threaten civilization itself. But this monopoly would not last. Even as American leaders debated how to safeguard or share the secrets of atomic energy, other nations were already moving. The Soviet Union, which had received intelligence on the Manhattan Project during the war, accelerated its own nuclear program. By 1949, the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic bomb, ending the brief era of American nuclear dominance and inaugurating the nuclear arms race that would come to define the Cold War. Between 1950 and 1962, the United States expanded its nuclear arsenal from 369 to over 27,000 weapons, while the Soviet stockpile grew from a handful to about 3,300. The first months and years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were marked by urgent debate about what could and should be done to contain this new force. The bombings themselves quickly became some of the most controversial acts in modern history. Even in the immediate post-war period, questions swirled about the necessity and morality of using the bombs. Some argued that the attacks had prevented an even more devastating invasion of Japan, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Others insisted that the destruction of two cities and the mass death of civilians was unnecessary, or even criminal. These debates have persisted for generations, with American public opinion shifting significantly over the decades. In 1945, a vast majority approved the bombings, but by 2025, perspectives are far more divided. On the global stage, the existence of nuclear weapons prompted early attempts at international control. In the late 1940s, American officials proposed various plans to the United Nations for the oversight and regulation of atomic energy. The Acheson-Lilienthal report recommended the creation of an atomic development authority, while the Baruch plan sought international supervision to prevent the proliferation of nuclear arms. These efforts, however, quickly ran aground on the shoals of Cold War suspicion. The Soviets viewed American proposals with deep mistrust, suspecting that the United States intended to maintain its advantage. Talks stalled, and the world slipped inexorably into a nuclear standoff. The emergence of deliverable strategic nuclear weapons led to a new way of thinking about war itself. The doctrine that would become known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, began to take shape. The principle was stark. Any nuclear attack by one superpower would be met with overwhelming retaliation, ensuring mutual annihilation. This was not an American doctrine alone. The United States' deterrent strategy evolved to guarantee that it could strike back at any level of conflict, not just with massive retaliation, but with a range of options. For the first time in history, the mere possession of weapons became the primary deterrent to their use. As the nuclear age unfolded, militaries, diplomats, and citizens around the world grappled with the implications of living under the shadow of atomic doom. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended one war, but they also set the stage for a long and uneasy peace, punctuated by arms races, diplomatic crises, and the ever-present possibility of catastrophe. International attempts to control nuclear technology faltered, and the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union deepened into what would become the Cold War. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, emerging from these early years, would shape the strategies and fears of generations to come. Yet, even as governments amassed arsenals and refined their doctrines, the fundamental questions raised by the dawn of the nuclear age remained unanswered. How could such power be controlled? Could humanity find a way to live with the knowledge that it could destroy itself? In those first days after Trinity, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, the world glimpsed both the heights of scientific achievement and the depths of potential destruction. The dawn of the nuclear age was not just a moment in time. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which the survival of civilization itself would depend on the choices, fears, and hopes of those who wielded the atom's power. The years following World War II were marked by a tension that was both invisible and ever-present, a global anxiety rooted not in armies massed on borders, but in the knowledge that destruction could arrive suddenly and from afar. As the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers, their rivalry was defined not only by ideology or geography, but by the silent, ever-growing presence of nuclear weapons. This was a new kind of standoff, one in which the very logic of survival required a willingness to threaten and possibly endure annihilation. At the center of this era was the doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The concept was starkly simple, but its consequences were profound. Once both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough deliverable nuclear weapons, any direct conflict between them would be suicidal. The certainty that each side could retaliate with overwhelming force, destroying not only military targets, but entire societies, became the foundation for peace, or at least the absence of war between the superpowers. The logic behind MAD was deeply psychological. If both sides understood that a nuclear attack would guarantee their own destruction, neither would dare to strike first. This balance of terror, as it was often called, was meant to deter not only the actual use of nuclear weapons, but even the temptation to attempt a decisive first blow. Yet this logic did not emerge fully formed from the minds of strategists. It developed gradually, shaped by the evolving arms race and the shifting balance of power. Early in the Cold War, American defense planners still considered the possibility of a disarming first strike, an attack so swift and thorough that it could eliminate the Soviet Union's nuclear forces before they could respond. But as both sides expanded their arsenals and improved their delivery systems, it became clear that a true first strike was impossible. Survivable forces, missiles hidden in silos, submarines prowling the oceans meant that even after absorbing a devastating attack, both nations could still retaliate. By the 1960s, the impossibility of eliminating the enemy's nuclear arsenal in a single blow led American and Soviet planners to embrace MAD as the central principle of their defense strategies. Game theory, a branch of mathematics focused on strategic decision-making, provided an intellectual framework for MAD. In game theoretic terms, when two players each have the ability to destroy the other, but only at the cost of their own destruction, the rational choice is to avoid conflict entirely. It is a paradoxical kind of stability, one built not on trust, but on the certainty of catastrophe. The credibility of this threat rested on the size and survivability of each side's nuclear forces, not merely on the total number of warheads. Analysis at the time showed that as long as each superpower maintained a force capable of surviving a first strike and delivering a devastating counterblow, the deterrent effect would hold. However, the doctrine was never as simple or absolute as it seemed. Declassified documents from the era reveal that American and Soviet planners sometimes disagreed about what mutual destruction would actually entail. Would an exchange of nuclear fire necessarily involve attacks on allies, or could it be limited to the superpowers themselves? Interpretations of MAD varied, and debates raged within governments about how much destruction to threaten and which targets to prioritize. Some strategists feared that focusing on the enemy's nuclear forces rather than cities might actually make war more likely by encouraging each side to strike first before its own arsenal could be destroyed. For these critics, the logic of MAD threatening overwhelming retaliation against cities and civilians offered a more stable, if morally troubling, deterrent. The arms race itself was relentless. Between 1941 and 1991, the United States, the Soviet Union, and other nations conducted over 2,000 nuclear tests, expanding their arsenals to staggering levels. By 1986, the United States and the Soviet Union together possessed approximately 70,500 nuclear weapons, enough, by any estimate, to destroy humanity many times over. The scale of this buildup was unprecedented, shaping every aspect of international politics. Each side sought not just to match the other's numbers, but to ensure that its weapons could survive attack and deliver retaliation. Submarines carrying ballistic missiles became the ultimate guarantors of second-strike capability. Nearly impossible to find and destroy, they rendered any hope of a successful first strike futile. The United States' nuclear strategy evolved through several distinct phases as the balance of power shifted. After initially adopting a doctrine of massive retaliation, the promise to respond to any Soviet aggression with overwhelming nuclear force, American planners began to recognize the dangers of such an all-or-nothing approach. The doctrine of flexible response emerged, allowing for a range of military options and aiming to keep conflicts from escalating to full nuclear exchange. But as the Soviet Union achieved near parity in nuclear capability by the 1960s, the logic of mutual assured destruction became central. With both superpowers able to inflict unacceptable damage on one another, deterrence based on mutual destruction became the cornerstone of Cold War nuclear strategy. Mutual assured destruction's influence on American thinking was particularly strong. Primary source collections from the era show how deeply the doctrine shaped United States defense planning, diplomatic maneuvering, and even public rhetoric. The United States built its strategic posture around the idea that any nuclear attack, no matter how limited, would trigger a response devastating enough to ensure mutual annihilation. This was not just military policy, it was a psychological weapon, a way to convince adversaries and allies alike that nuclear war could have no winners. For the Soviet Union, the logic of mutual assured destruction was equally compelling, though filtered through its own strategic culture and historical experiences. Both nations invested heavily in systems designed to guarantee retaliation, command and control networks, hardened missile silos, and fleets of submarines. The result was a kind of enforced stability. As long as each side believed the other could and would strike back, the unthinkable remained unthinkable. Yet the stability of mutual assured destruction was always fragile. Analysts recognized that all-out nuclear war was most likely if either side came to believe the other was preparing a large-scale attack. In such a scenario, the incentive to strike first, rather than risk losing the ability to retaliate, could become overwhelming. Despite mutual assured destruction's deterrent power, debate over its ethics and effectiveness never ceased. Some argued that the doctrine kept the peace, preventing not only nuclear war, but even major conventional conflicts between the superpowers. Others saw it as a form of collective madness, one that held the world hostage to the threat of total destruction. The psychological burden of living under mutual assured destruction shaped generations, influencing everything from popular culture to the conduct of diplomacy. As the Cold War progressed, both the United States and the Soviet Union continued to refine their strategies, seeking ways to maintain the credibility of deterrence while reducing the risk of accidental or unauthorized launches. Yet the basic logic endured. As long as each side possessed large, survivable nuclear forces, neither could hope to escape the consequences of starting a war. This was the grim calculus of the age, a world in which survival depended on the promise of shared doom. By the late 1980s, the sheer scale of nuclear arsenals and the persistent threat of annihilation spurred new efforts at arms control and dialogue. But the shadow of mutually assured destruction continued to loom over international affairs. a reminder that in the nuclear age, the greatest deterrent to war was the certainty that no one could win. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, for all its paradoxes and perils, had become the defining feature of Cold War strategy, shaping the destinies of nations and the fate of the world itself. In October 1962, the world held its breath. News bulletins crackled with rumors of war, leaders paced sleeplessly in their offices, and ordinary citizens from Washington to Moscow wondered if each sunrise might be their last. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it would come to be known, was the closest humanity ever came to crossing the nuclear Rubicon. During those tense 13 days, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD as it was often called, was no longer an abstract theory but a palpable, existential reality. The fate of millions, perhaps the entire planet, seemed to hinge on the choices of a handful of men, their calculations, their courage, and above all, their willingness to step back from the brink. The origins of the crisis lay in secrecy and mistrust. Soviet leaders, seeking to redress what they saw as a strategic imbalance, began covertly shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles from American shores. When the United States discovered the installations through aerial reconnaissance, it faced a stark dilemma. The presence of these missiles threatened not only American cities, but also the carefully calibrated balance of terror that defined the Cold War. If the Soviets could launch a nuclear strike from Cuba, the time available for American leaders to detect and respond would shrink to just minutes. A chilling prospect in a world ruled by split-second decisions and hair-trigger alerts. What followed was a 13-day standoff that has since become the classic case study in nuclear statecraft. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors convened in secret, weighing options that ranged from airstrikes to invasion. At the heart of their deliberations was the knowledge that a misstep, miscommunication, a misread signal, or an overzealous commander could unleash devastation on an unimaginable scale. The United States announced a naval quarantine, a blockade in all but name, to prevent further Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. American warships fanned out across the Caribbean, while B-52 bombers stood ready, engines humming, loaded with nuclear weapons. For 13 days, the world was poised on the edge of destruction. Yet behind the scenes, a different kind of battle was being waged, not with weapons, but with words, calculations, and diplomacy. Both sides, acutely aware of the logic of MAD, understood that a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. This insight shaped every move, every message, every decision. Diplomats and leaders drew on game theory, employing strategies akin to the Nash equilibrium, in which neither side would benefit from unilaterally escalating the crisis. The realization that survival required mutual constraint and coexistence was never more evident than in the secret back-channel communications that ultimately diffused the standoff. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy exchanged a series of letters, their tone growing increasingly urgent and personal as the crisis deepened. Khrushchev, in particular, emphasized the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, writing with a sense of shared humanity and mutual vulnerability. Declassified documents from both sides, military briefings, intelligence estimates, diplomatic cables, revealed the extraordinary complexity of crisis management at the highest levels. Even as public rhetoric remained defiant, private correspondence and back-channel negotiations were marked by a sober understanding of the stakes. The resolution of the crisis hinged on compromise and the careful management of perceptions. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba, while the United States pledged publicly not to invade the island. Privately, American officials also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession kept secret at the time to avoid the appearance of weakness. This delicate bargain, hammered out through both official and unofficial channels, allowed both sides to claim victory of sorts while stepping back from the abyss. The peaceful outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis is widely regarded as a triumph of diplomacy and crisis management. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge, but through careful negotiation and mutual restraint, disaster was averted. The episode left a profound mark on both superpowers. The reality of mutually assured destruction, brought vividly to life during those fateful days, underscored the necessity of coexistence and constraint. Leaders on both sides recognized that the very existence of nuclear weapons imposed a kind of shared fate, one that demanded new forms of communication, understanding, and, above all, humility. In the immediate aftermath, steps were taken to reduce the risk of future misunderstandings. The creation of the Washington-Moscow hotline provided a direct, secure channel for communication between the leaders of the two nuclear superpowers, meant to prevent delays or confusion in moments of crisis. The following year, the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. These measures, though modest, reflected a dawning awareness that arms control and crisis communication were not luxuries but necessities in a world governed by the logic of mutual destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis has been pored over by scholars, dissected in hundreds of books and articles, and remains the best documented case of nuclear brinkmanship. It stands as a timeless lesson in the dangers of miscalculation and the paramount importance of crisis management. The crisis exposed not only the risks of deliberate escalation, but also the ever-present threat of accident or misunderstanding. Even as Kennedy and Khrushchev acted with caution, there were moments, unknown to the public at the time, when lower-level commanders or misinterpreted signals could have sparked catastrophe. The possibility of accidental nuclear war, latent in every phase of the crisis, became an enduring concern for policymakers and the public alike. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of those 13 days is the recognition that, in a world shaped by mutually assured destruction, survival depends on more than just military might. It requires diplomacy, empathy, and the willingness to recognize the humanity of one's adversary. The events of October 1962 forced both the United States and the Soviet Union to confront the ultimate futility of nuclear war, an outcome in which there could be no winners, only survivors, if even that. This realization would shape the trajectory of arms control efforts, from the Test Ban Treaty to later agreements, and instill a cautious respect for the balance of terror that, paradoxically, preserved the peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not the end of Cold War tensions, nor did it eliminate the dangers inherent in a world bristling with nuclear arms, but it did mark a turning point, a moment when the leaders of the two superpowers looked into the abyss and recoiled. The crisis remains, to this day, the iconic example of mutually assured destruction's influence on international relations, a stark reminder that the threat of mutual destruction can drive even the bitterest of rivals toward dialogue and restraint. In the years that followed, the memory of those 13 days would serve as both a warning and a guide, shaping the conduct of diplomacy and the ongoing struggle to manage the most dangerous legacy of the 20th century. The story of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, extends far beyond the tense decades of the Cold War. Its legacy continues to cast a long shadow over international security, shaping how nations think about nuclear weapons, deterrence, and the very possibility of war. Even as the world changed, empires fell, new powers emerged, and technology advanced, MAD remained woven into the fabric of global politics, a doctrine both feared and, paradoxically, relied upon. But what does MAD mean in the 21st century, and what lessons does it offer for a world that is, in many ways, more complex and unpredictable than the one in which it originated? For many years, MAD was regarded as the ultimate safeguard against nuclear war. As long as opposing powers maintained secure arsenals capable of surviving a first strike and retaliating with devastating force, the logic held, neither side would risk starting a conflict that could end in mutual annihilation. This understanding shaped not only nuclear planning but also arms control agreements, diplomatic strategies, and the very concept of strategic stability. Yet, as the Cold War receded into history, the limitations of this framework became increasingly clear. The world was no longer neatly divided between two superpowers. The immense nuclear stockpiles that once defined the United States, Soviet rivalry were significantly reduced, bringing both new hopes and new challenges. Some experts began to argue that the traditional MAD-based concept of strategic stability was a product of its time, tied to the specific conditions and anxieties of the Cold War era. As political confidence grew and nuclear arsenals shrank, policymakers and analysts started to explore new frameworks, such as Mutual Assured Protection, or MAP, which emphasized cooperative security and defensive measures over the threat of retaliation. Yet, the transition was far from smooth. The disappearance of arms parity, the collapse of long-standing treaties, and the rise of new nuclear powers complicated the landscape. As China expanded its arsenal and Russia pursued modernization, the comforting symmetry of the Cold War balance gave way to a much more uncertain reality. In the early 21st century, the threat of nuclear terror resurfaced as arms parity vanished, long-standing treaties were suspended or allowed to lapse, and new nuclear powers expanded their arsenals. The suspension of agreements like the new START treaty and the rise of multipolar nuclear competition increased risks and eroded the guardrails that once restrained arsenals. Instead of a simple bipolar standoff, the world now faced a multipolar nuclear environment with multiple states and, crucially, non-state actors, pursuing weapons or technologies that could undermine existing deterrent strategies. This new complexity did not lessen the threat of nuclear Armageddon. If anything, it made the dangers more diffuse and, in some ways, harder to manage. The dilemmas of deterrence, which once seemed so clearly defined in the era of MAD, proved remarkably persistent. Questions about the credibility of threats, the security of alliances, and the possibility of miscalculation continued to trouble policymakers. In this climate, nuclear deterrence began to regain importance as great power competition intensified and arms control efforts stalled. Far from fading into irrelevance, the basic logic of MAD deterrence, through the fear of mutual destruction, remained a key, if contested, element of international security. Yet the doctrine was not without its critics. Many argued that the existence of nuclear weapons continued to generate temptation and risk, fueling international tensions and perpetuating a cycle of fear. The world remained caught in a psychological trap, with MAD looming overhead, a constant reminder that the power to destroy civilization lay just a few decisions away. The risk of miscalculation, the challenge of new technologies, and the need for updated strategies all contributed to a growing sense that the old rules no longer applied, or at least needed to be revised. One of the most significant challenges to the logic of mutually assured destruction in recent years has come from technological innovation. Advances in hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare have threatened the survivability of retaliatory capabilities, undermining the confidence that once underpinned deterrence. If a nation cannot be sure its nuclear forces will survive an attack and be able to respond, the entire structure of mutual assured destruction becomes unstable. In response, new strategies, such as the so-called nuclear pentad, which would diversify and strengthen retaliatory options, have been proposed to restore deterrence and stability. At the same time, the logic of mutually assured destruction has begun to spill over into new domains. Some analysts have drawn comparisons between nuclear deterrence and the emerging idea of mutually assured debilitation in cyber warfare, where the threat of devastating retaliation in the digital realm might serve to keep potential adversaries in check. Whether this analogy holds true, and whether it can provide the same uneasy stability as nuclear mutually assured destruction, remains an open question. What is clear is that the very concept of deterrence is evolving, driven by technological change and shifting global realities. Arms control, once seen as a hopeful path out of the nuclear dilemma, has struggled to keep pace. As new weapons and technologies proliferate and as trust between major powers erodes, efforts to negotiate meaningful limitations have often stalled. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted in 2021, represents the most ambitious attempt yet to eliminate nuclear arsenals entirely. Yet none of the existing nuclear powers have signed on, leaving the world in a familiar bind. Mutually assured destruction and deterrence remain the practical realities, even as many yearn for a world beyond them. Not everyone agrees on the continued relevance of mutually assured destruction. Some see it as an outdated doctrine, one that may actually increase the risk of accidental war or escalation by locking nations into rigid patterns of threat and counter-threat. Others argue that, in a world of multiple nuclear actors and rapidly changing technology, the old logic simply cannot account for all the variables. The narrow definition of strategic stability that equates it with mutually assured destruction, some experts warn, may obscure broader security concerns and create instability at lower levels of conflict, where nuclear weapons are not the only or even the primary tools of coercion. Yet, for all its limitations, mutually assured destruction still exerts a powerful influence. Secure second-strike capabilities remain the gold standard for deterrence, and differences in arsenal size matter less than the confidence each side has in its ability to respond. But even here, doubts persist. If an adversary does not believe in the credibility of mutually assured destruction or suspects that its own forces are vulnerable, the temptation to compete, modernize, or even strike first can grow. Scholars continue to debate whether mutually assured destruction truly promoted stability or whether it simply drove an endless cycle of competition and arms racing. The legacy of mutually assured destruction, then, is deeply ambivalent. It has helped prevent the use of the most powerful weapons ever created, but it has done so at the cost of constant vigilance, recurring crises, and the ever-present risk of catastrophe. The world remains haunted by the possibility of nuclear disaster, even as it searches for new ways to manage the danger. In the end, the lessons of mutually assured destruction are both cautionary and unresolved. The existence of nuclear weapons ensures that the threat of annihilation can never be fully banished from international politics. Whether humanity can move beyond this condition through disarmament, new forms of deterrence, or some yet unimagined breakthrough remains one of the central questions of our time. For now, the shadow of mutually assured destruction lingers, shaping the choices of nations and the fate of the world.